They said he had buried 3 wives. They said the ash on his armor never came from enemy fires. It came from villages he'd ordered burned to the ground for sport. They said his first word as a child was not mother or father, but burn, and that the servants who heard it ran and never came back. In the cathedral of Vareth's capital, on the morning he was to take his 4th bride, 500 nobles held their breath and waited for the plain orphan girl standing at the altar to faint, flee, or die of fright before the ceremony even began. What none of them expected, what none of them could have prepared for, was what happened when she didn't. The morning of Selene Ravaryn's wedding arrived the way most disasters do. Quietly, without warning, dressed in ordinary light. She stood at the narrow window of the room they had given her in the House of Wards, the last real home she had known since her parents' deaths 6 years prior, and watched dawn break gray and colorless over the capital's rooftops. The city of Vareth Prime was already awake. She could hear it. The distant clatter of market carts, the low toll of the watchtower bell, the particular kind of noise a city makes when it has decided something is worth watching. Today, that something was her. She was 22 years old. She owned 3 dresses that fit properly, a box of her mother's letters tied with cord, and a small iron ring her father had pressed into her palm the morning before imperial soldiers came to their house and took him away. She had nothing else. No land, no allies, no family name that still carried weight. House Ravaryn had been mid-tier once, comfortable, unremarkable, the kind of house that attended court functions and was promptly forgotten. Then her father had voted against the emperor's grain seizure bill, and that had been the end of comfortable and unremarkable. The empire had not jailed him. That would have been too visible, too clean. Instead, it had simply crushed him the way it crushed everything inconvenient, through debt, through bureaucratic delays, through the withdrawal of contracts and licenses until the house collapsed under its own weight, and her father collapsed with it. He had died of what the physicians listed as fever. Selene had sat at his bedside and knew it was something else entirely. Some people, she had learned, died of being broken. The body just finished what despair started. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and let herself feel it for exactly 1 more minute. The grief, the fear, the very specific humiliation of knowing that every person in this city pitied her, not with the warm pity that helped, but the cold, entertained pity of people watching a spectacle they had already decided the outcome of. The Ash Duke, they called him. Duke Cassian Valecrest of the Northern Reach, Lord of Blackthorn Keep, First Blade of the Vareth campaign, Warlord of the Siege at Krenna Pass. The titles went on. They always went on. What the titles didn't say was what every whisper in every corridor of every noble house in the capital had been saying for the 3 weeks since the betrothal was announced. He was 51 years old. He had been married 3 times. The first wife had died in childbirth. The second had died of illness, though the illness was heavily questioned in certain circles. The third had lasted 4 months before she was found at the base of the Eastern Tower at Blackthorn Keep, and the official report had listed it as an accident, and no one had believed it, and no one had said so. He was not, by any account anyone gave, a man capable of being loved. Selene straightened up from the window. Behind her, the 2 women assigned to dress her were already waiting. Not her handmaids, she had none, but servants of the House of Wards, who looked at her the way you look at something you have been asked to carry that you'd rather not touch. She turned from the window and let them work in silence because there was nothing she could say that would make any of this different. The dress was white, not the rich, warm white of a bride who had been prepared for this day with love and anticipation. It was the flat, institutional white of something that had been prepared by an imperial administrator on a budget, without sentiment. It fit her adequately. That was the most that could be said. It made her look exactly what she was. A plain girl in an adequate dress being walked toward a future that had not asked for her input. She heard them later. The maid on the left, thinking she had left the room, murmuring to the other one, "Poor creature. He'll break her in a month. She hasn't got the bones for it." Selene stood in the corridor outside and said nothing and walked toward the waiting carriage. She had always been better at swallowing things than at spitting them out. It was one of the qualities that had kept her alive through 6 years of charity, which was to say 6 years of being kept just comfortable enough that no one had to feel guilty, and just uncomfortable enough to remember she was a burden. She climbed into the carriage alone. But the Cathedral of Vareth seated 700. Today, it was at capacity. They had come from every major house, the old nobility in their velvet and gold, the new money that Emperor Lucian had elevated since taking the throne, the imperial court functionaries with their careful smiles and their careful eyes. Everyone measuring everyone else to determine how much this wedding mattered, what it meant, and how they should position themselves accordingly. A wedding between the emperor's most feared warlord and a penniless orphan from a disgraced minor house was, in the cold calculus of Varath's political machinery, essentially meaningless. The question of why Cassian Valecrest had chosen her, why he had requested her specifically, had sent the betrothal papers to the House of Wards without warning, without courtship, without negotiation, was one that had occupied considerable dinner table conversation over the past 3 weeks. Most of the theories were unkind, some were obscene. The most popular held that he'd simply wanted a wife who would have no allies, no leverage, and no family who could demand retribution when she died. Selene heard none of this as she rode toward the cathedral. She had stopped listening to what people said about her around the age of 14, not because it stopped hurting, it never entirely stopped hurting, but because there was a finite amount of space inside a person, and she had chosen to fill hers with things that were at least partially within her control. She watched the city through the carriage window. She cataloged details the way she had taught herself to do whenever fear threatened to make her small. The color of the stone on the cathedral's eastern face, lighter than the western because the morning sun had been at it for centuries. The specific way the crowd gathered outside the cathedral doors parted for the carriage, creating an aisle of stairs, some curious, some openly derisive. One old woman near the fountain who crossed her arms and shook her head at nothing in particular. A vendor selling roasted nuts from a cart 50 yards down the street, entirely uninterested, focused on his work with the serene indifference of a man who understood that weddings and politics were not his problem. She envied him briefly. Then the carriage stopped. The inside of the cathedral was cold. This was the first thing she registered as she stepped through the doors on the arm of a ward's administrator who had been assigned this duty with the enthusiasm of a man filing tax documents. The cold was institutional, stone-preserved, the kind of cold that said, this space belongs to something larger than you, and has been here much longer and will continue to be here long after you are dust. It was oddly grounding. She did not look at the crowd immediately. She looked at the end of the aisle. He was standing there with his back partially to the altar, turned just enough that she could see his profile. He was in military dress, not the ceremonial uniform most nobles wore to these functions, the kind with decorative armor and embellishments designed for appearance. He wore actual armor, worn and battle-dark, with the rank insignia of the Northern Reach on his left shoulder and nothing decorative anywhere that she could identify. He was tall, not the theatrical height of men who had been trained to stand in ways that maximized their presence, simply tall in the way of someone who had never thought about it, which was somehow worse. He stood with the stillness of a man who had been still in worse places than this. She started walking. The whispers began almost immediately. She caught fragments the way you catch cold, not the full thing, just enough to register. Couldn't they have found someone, and at least make him wait for something worth, and then something worse, from a woman in a blue gown sitting in the second row on the left, that she didn't catch fully, but whose tone landed like a slap. Her jaw tightened. She kept walking. She looked at the floor 2 steps in front of her feet, which was a technique she had developed at 14 for navigating rooms that wished she wasn't in them, and she counted her steps without counting them, which was a different kind of technique for the same problem. She was perhaps halfway down the aisle when she became aware that the whispers had not stopped. They had, if anything, grown bolder. The particular boldness of a crowd that has decided its collective amusement outweighs its decorum, the social contract fraying just slightly at the edges. Someone laughed, not loud, but deliberate, placed, and it was picked up by 2 or 3 others, and for a moment the cathedral held the sound of politely contained derision in a space designed for reverence, and the combination was grotesque. She stopped. Not because she wanted to stop. Something in her legs simply did it, a reflex. The body registering humiliation as a physical event. She had 3 seconds, maybe 4, before stopping became a statement instead of a stumble. She used one of those seconds to breathe. She used another to lift her gaze from the floor to the altar. He was looking at her. Cassian Valecrest was looking directly at her, not at the crowd, not at the officiating minister, not at the space above her head in the way powerful men often looked when they were technically facing someone they did not consider worth full attention. He was looking at her with an expression she had no immediate name for. Not pity, not impatience, not the cold assessment she had prepared herself for. Something quieter than any of that. Something that sat behind his eyes and did not advertise itself. She held that gaze for a full 3 seconds. She wasn't sure why. Something in it required it. Then she started walking again. The laughter from the crowd was peaking when she reached the altar. She heard it, the way you hear rain, present and inescapable but no longer information you need to process. She came to stand beside the man she was going to marry and faced forward and waited. She was not looking at him when it happened. She heard it more than saw it. A change in the ambient noise of the cathedral, a sudden and very specific silence that had a different quality than ordinary quiet. It was the silence of several hundred people simultaneously deciding that whatever they had been about to do, they no longer felt like doing it. She turned her head. Cassian Valecrest had turned to face the congregation. Not all the way. He remained half-oriented toward the altar, but enough. His right hand had moved to the pommel of the short blade at his hip, not drawn, simply resting there with a familiarity that was in itself more threatening than anything drawn could have been. He was not looking at any one person. He was looking at all of them, and what was on his face was not anger, which would have been readable, digestible, something a room full of nobles knew how to handle. It was nothing. It was the precise, unhurried nothing of a man who has done things that rooms like this could not contain and who found their social rituals and their manicured cruelties beneath contempt. The silence extended. Not a single person in the cathedral made a sound. He held it for what felt like much longer than it probably was, 7 seconds, perhaps 10, and then he turned back to the altar as though nothing had happened, as though he was simply a man returning his attention to a ministerial reading, as though 700 nobles had not just been informed by a single look that they were allowed to be here by his sufferance and nothing else. The minister, who had gone the color of old chalk, began to speak. Selene stood very still and thought, oh. She did not speak to him during the ceremony. There was nothing in the ceremony that required it beyond the vow responses, which were brief and functional, and she said them in the same voice she used when she wanted to sound calmer than she was. She felt him say his beside her, not heard, exactly, but registered the way you register something low frequency, through the chest rather than the ears. He had a voice that was exactly what she might have expected. Textured, used hard, the kind of voice that had given orders in places where orders determined who lived and who didn't, and had been doing this long enough that even in a cathedral reading ceremonial words, it carried the residue of that history. Afterward, there was the formal signing of the house papers, which were handled by their respective representatives. She had a ward's administrator. He had a northern legal officer who looked like he had been handling Valecrest documents for 20 years and had made peace with every item that had crossed his desk. The nobles filed out. The imperial court representatives moved toward the reception hall in the western annex, where there would be food and wine and politically coded conversation conducted at volumes calibrated to create the impression of privacy they all knew didn't exist. Selene stood near a stone pillar in the now emptying cathedral and thought about what happened next. She had been told, in the brief administrative meeting 3 days prior, that she would travel with the Duke to Blackthorn Keep following the ceremony. She had been told to pack for cold weather and bring nothing large. She had been told she would have her own chamber. These were the facts she possessed. They were not a great many facts to build a life on. She became aware that he was standing a few feet away. She turned. He had dismissed most of his party, the legal officer, the 2 northern soldiers who had served as ceremonial guard. He was watching her with the same quality of attention he'd had in the ceremony, concentrated and without performance. Up close, the damage of his life was visible in a way it hadn't been from a distance. There was old scarring along the left jaw line, a deep one that had healed imperfectly, pulling the skin slightly out of true. The gray in his hair was not the silver of well-kept age, but the particular ashen tone of someone who had been white-haired since their 40s, she suspected. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that did not come from smiling. He was old, by the measures she'd grown up with. Not decrepit, nothing about him suggested weakness, physical or otherwise, but old in the way of something that had survived long past when survival was comfortable, had gone on beyond the point where most men found reasons to continue, and had kept going through some combination of will and momentum and the particular stubbornness of people who have nothing left to prove and prove things anyway. She said the only thing she could think of that was both true and relatively safe. You didn't have to do that. He looked at her. The expression again was something she couldn't fully categorize. I know, he said. They'll be worse for it, she said. Some of them. They don't like being made to be quiet. Some of them, he said, are welcome to be worse. I've had worse. She believed him. She said nothing. We leave within the hour, he said. There are traveling clothes if the ones you have are not adequate for northern roads. Tell the aide outside if you need them. He walked toward the cathedral doors. She watched him go. At the doorway he paused without turning around. Ravaryn, he said. She was surprised he used the name. Yes. If anyone spoke to you today in a way that you want me aware of, he said, tell me. A pause. And if I don't want you to do anything about it? The pause from his end was shorter. Then I'll know it anyway. He walked out. The cathedral was empty except for her and the low sound of wind pushing at the old stones. She stood there for a moment and catalogued one more detail, the specific feeling of not knowing, for the first time in 6 years, whether what was coming next was better or worse than what had come before. It was not hope. Hope was too expensive a thing to be running on at this stage. It was something more structural than that, more like the absence of certainty in a direction she had not previously considered. She went to find the aide. What? The road north took 3 days. She rode in a covered coach. Good quality, not ceremonial, the kind built for actual travel rather than appearance. The party was 15 people, herself, Cassian, 6 soldiers, 2 aides, and miscellaneous staff. Cassian rode for the most part on horseback, which she was privately relieved by. She was not ready for sustained proximity. She needed the 3 days to think, which was one of the few things she'd always been able to do adequately under adverse conditions. She thought about what she knew and what she didn't. She thought about the ward mother's whispers. He'll break her in a month. She hasn't got the bones for it. She thought about the second-row woman in the blue gown and the particular quality of that laugh. She thought about her father's iron ring, which she was wearing on her right hand because it didn't fit any of the left-hand fingers properly. And she thought about the last thing he'd told her before the fever took whatever was left. Survive everything, he'd said. But don't just survive, that's not the point. Surviving is just the part before the point. She hadn't known what the point was supposed to be. She still wasn't sure she knew. On the second afternoon, the coach stopped for water at a northern crossroads, and Cassian appeared at the coach door without announcement. He opened it and looked at her in the practical, unsentimental way of a man who was checking on a variable he had factored into his planning. Road's good for another hour, then it gets rough, he said. You can ride if you'd prefer it to the coach on bad road. Your choice. She looked at him. I can ride. Then ride. She had her own horse by the next morning, a gray mare with a calm temperament named, according to the stable hand, Frost. She was not a spectacular rider, but she was competent, and competence was what the road required. She rode near the middle of the party, not beside Cassian, not tucked back with the aides, just in the middle where the travel felt least like a statement either way. On the third morning she came forward. She wasn't entirely sure why. Something about the quality of the light on the northern hills, maybe, which was a different quality than southern light. Harder, more specific, less interested in being beautiful. She came up beside him, and they rode in silence for what might have been 20 minutes, which was long enough that when she spoke it didn't feel like an intrusion. How old is the keep? She asked. He looked over. Whatever he'd expected her to say, it apparently wasn't that. Parts of it are 800 years, he said. Eastern wall is original. The rest has been rebuilt at various points. Who by? My grandfather rebuilt the south tower after it burned. My father added the inner wall. A pause. I added the northern garrison. After the Krene campaign? The look he gave her now had a slightly different quality. You know about Krene. I read the military historian's account, she said. There were 3 versions and they each told a different story. What story did you come to? That the campaign succeeded, she said, because you were willing to do something the other commanders weren't. He said nothing. I don't know if that's a compliment, she added. I'm still deciding. Something moved in his expression. Not a smile, nothing that simple. Something quieter, seated deeper. He looked back at the road ahead. Most people don't decide, he said. They just pick the version that sits easiest. Most people, she said, haven't had occasion to learn how expensive comfort is. Another silence. Longer this time. 800 years, he said finally. And cold most of the year. The winters are real winters, nothing polished about them. She looked at the hills. Good. Blackthorn Keep appeared on the horizon at late afternoon of the 3rd day, and it was nothing like the representation she'd seen in the capital's illustrated histories. Those had emphasized its military architecture, the high walls, the towers, the commanding position above the eastern river valley, in ways that made it look designed, intentional, a symbol of power given solid form. What she saw was something rawer than that. It was large. That was the first and most honest thing about it. Large in the way of something that had grown without a plan, built and rebuilt, and extended over centuries by people who had not consulted each other about aesthetics. The original eastern wall was black-gray stone, old and dense, the color of something that had been absorbing weather for 8 centuries and didn't intend to stop. The keep tower rose above everything, not elegant but imposing in the way of geological features. It was simply there, and it had been there, and the implication was that it intended to continue. Smoke rose from 3 chimneys. The banner above the gatehouse was the Valecrest House sigil, a skeletal ash tree on dark gray, branches reaching without leaves. She'd seen representations of it in the capital, where it was treated as a symbol of menace. Up here, against the actual sky, against the actual land, it looked different. It looked like a thing that had grown in difficult soil and decided to stay standing anyway. She had not expected to find it anything but desolate. The word everyone in the capital used for Blackthorn was desolate, cold, desolate, remote, impossible, the kind of fortress where reasonable people didn't choose to live. She cataloged it differently, substantial, real, a place where weather and stone and necessity had made something that had no interest in impressing anyone. It was, in a strange way she hadn't anticipated, the first place she'd seen in a long time that wasn't lying about what it was. The gates opened as they approached, and the soldiers on the walls were watching with the efficient attention of people who took their work seriously. Inside the courtyard, a small assembly waited, household staff, she gathered, standing in the precise alignment of people who had been told to be present and had made their peace with that. A woman at the front, middle-aged, built like someone who had carried things for decades and didn't stop, with a keyring at her hip the size of a small weapon. Cassian dismounted. She dismounted. He didn't help her. She hadn't expected him to. He said to the woman with the keyring, "Marin, this is the Duchess. Show her the house." Marin looked at her with the careful, neutral expression of a woman who had outlasted 3 previous duchesses and was withholding judgment on the probability of a 4th. "My lady," she said, with the toneless courtesy of someone who would decide what they actually thought in their own time. Cassian had already walked past, exchanging words with the officer at the courtyard gate, and was gone into the keep with the unhurried efficiency of a man who regarded his residence as a functional space rather than a home. Selene watched him go. "Well," said Marin at her shoulder, "there are worse ways to arrive." "What would be a worse way?" Selene asked, genuinely curious. Marin considered. "The second Duchess," she said, "arrived in tears and didn't stop for 4 days." She paused. "The third arrived not crying at all, which we all thought was better, until it turned out she was just saving it." "I'm not the crying kind," Selene said. Marin looked at her again, this time with something that was not quite warmth, but was at least a willingness to revise the opening position. "Good," she said. Kitchen fire will be up in an hour. I'll show you where things are. They were 3 weeks at the keep before she saw the things she hadn't expected to see. The first weeks were an exercise in learning the specific grammar of the place. Blackthorn ran on military logic, scheduled, functional, built around the needs of the garrison and the northern estate rather than the ceremonial requirements of a noble household. The staff were not servile in the way of capital households. They were practical people who did what was needed without theater. She found this on balance more honest than the alternative. She learned the keep room by room. The great hall, which was large enough to seat the garrison, but cold in a way that seemed engineered. The kitchens, which were the warmest part of the house, and the most functionally alive. The library, which surprised her. 3 walls of it, floor to ceiling, an actual working collection rather than a decorative one, with books pulled out and replaced and handled until their spines cracked. She found, on the 3rd shelf from the left in the back corner, the same military historian's 3-volume account of the Krenny campaign that she had read in the ward's library. 2 of the 3 volumes had margin notes in a tight, economical hand she assumed was Cassian's. She didn't read the margin notes. Not yet. She did what she had always done when placed in a situation she hadn't chosen. She found the things she could affect. The kitchen needed better organization. She worked with Marin to restructure the stores. 2 of the younger servants had been given conflicting instructions by 2 different senior staff members and spent most of their days working at cross purposes. She asked each one a few questions and resolved it without making it a formal matter. The garden wards at the south side of the courtyard had been left essentially fallow since the last season. She didn't have the expertise to do much about it, but she walked it with the groundskeeper and asked questions and understood what it would need when spring came. She was not trying to make herself useful. That was the thing she kept having to correct in herself. The reflex of a person who had spent 6 years justifying her own existence by her utility. She was doing it because the keep needed it, and she was there and had hands, and because in the doing she didn't have to think about the capital and the cathedral and the specific quality of that laughter. Cassian watched all of this, not intrusively. From the distance at which he seemed to conduct most of his relationships, which was the distance at which you could observe a thing clearly and have adequate time to respond if it became a problem. She noticed he was watching the way she noticed most things, so peripherally, without acknowledgement, filling in the picture piece by piece. On the 19th day, one of the older soldiers in the garrison came to her. His name was Bram, and he'd been at the keep for 11 years, and he had the particular quality of deference of someone who was being deferential because they'd decided to be, not because they'd been told to. He told her, in roundabout terms, that there were 6 families in the northern village at the base of the Valley Road whose food stores had not been restocked from the autumn distribution because there had been an administrative error, and that it was now winter, and that this was the kind of thing that could become a real problem. She asked him whether the Duke was aware. Bram's expression became careful. "The Duke," he said, "is informed of what is brought to him." She understood what that meant. She went to Marin. Between them, they identified the stores that could be redistributed without impacting the keep's own winter supply, organized the transport, and had the situation addressed within 2 days. On the 22nd day, Cassian found her in the library. He came in without announcement. It was his library, and stood in the doorway for a moment. She was at the reading table with 2 of the estate ledgers, cross-referencing them for a discrepancy Marin had flagged. She heard him come in and continued what she was doing, because stopping and standing and waiting was a social behavior she was tired of performing for people she had no reason to perform it for. "The village stores," he said. She looked up. "Administrative error. It's been corrected." "I know." He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the carriage, in the cathedral, on the road, with that particular focused attention that did not advertise what it was thinking. "Who brought it to you?" "That's not something I'm willing to say." A pause. His expression didn't change. "Why not?" "Because whoever brought it to me did it because they thought I was approachable," she said. "If I give you names, I become someone who gives names to the Duke, and then I stop being approachable." Silence. The fire in the library hearth moved. Outside, wind applied itself to the walls with the focused patience that northern winters saved for structures that thought they were adequate. "You don't know yet," he said. Whether I would have acted on the name. No, she agreed. I don't. He looked at her for another few seconds. There was something in that look that she was beginning to recognize as distinct from his usual quality of attention. Something slightly off-center, slightly unguarded. The expression of someone who has been given an answer they didn't calculate for and is recalibrating. The stores were adequate? He asked, finally. They are now. He walked to one of the shelves, ran his hand along the spines the way someone does when they're not reading titles, just making contact. The ledger discrepancy, he said, is in the Eastern accounts. There's a notation on the 4th page that doesn't match the summary. She looked at the ledger, found the page. He was right. I would have found it, she said. I know, he said, and walked out. A week later, the imperial courier arrived. She knew something was wrong before she knew what it was. A change in the quality of sound in the courtyard below, the particular controlled urgency of soldiers who had received news and were processing it without showing it. She found Marin in the corridor, who looked at her with the expression of a woman who was deciding how much to say, and said, "Courier from the capital, you should go to the hall." The great hall had the particular atmosphere of a room that had received bad news and was waiting to do something about it. Cassian was at the far end at the situation table, the one with the estate maps and the campaign maps overlaid, a feature of the hall that she'd registered on first entry and not asked about yet. 3 of his senior officers were with him, and the courier was standing at the appropriate distance, which was far enough to indicate he understood that he had delivered something unwelcome. She stopped at the entrance. One of the officers saw her and made a slight motion toward Cassian, who looked up. He did not tell her to leave. She came forward. The letter on the table was imperial seal, the dark green wax of an administrative communication, not the gold of a personal imperial decree. She read the header because it was facing her. House Ravaryn, pending audit of former trading contracts, discrepancies. Crown revenue, 3rd year of Emperor Lucian's reign. She understood immediately. She had been working for her father's ghost for 6 years, and she knew exactly what this kind of letter looked like. It was not an audit. It was not about trading contracts. It was the Empire locating a pressure point and pressing it. A reminder that her family's remnants were still within reach, still useful as leverage, and that whoever had calculated that she was now a variable worth managing through Cassian Valecrest had decided to begin. She looked at him. "They're going to use the Ravaryn name," she said, because it was faster to say it than to wait for it to be explained. Something in his eyes went very quiet. "Yes. My father's been dead 4 years. There's nothing left to audit." "There doesn't need to be," he said. "No," she agreed. "There doesn't." One of the officers cleared his throat, a young one of the ones who still thought that the tactical problem was the one on the table. "My lord, if it's a matter of the documents, we could dispatch to the capital archives and—" "Renveld," Cassian said, not loudly. The officer stopped. "She knows what it is," Cassian said, without inflection. "It's not a documents problem." The courier was still standing at his respectful distance. Selene noticed he was the kind of courier who didn't show discomfort, which meant he was experienced, which meant he'd delivered difficult things before, and survived the delivery. She noted this detail without knowing yet why it mattered. "There will be a response to send back," she said to Cassian. "Yes." "I want to read it." He looked at her for a moment, not the controlled, careful look of a man deciding whether to allow something, but something more like the look of a man recalibrating again, revising a model that didn't quite fit the evidence. Then he said simply, "I know." The courier was dismissed, the officers dispersed by some signal she hadn't caught. She was alone with him at the situation table and the spread of maps and the letter that was not about trading contracts, and she looked at it and felt, beneath the cold recognition and the familiar weight of being a pawn in games that had been started without her, something specific and new. She was not in the wards anymore. She was not in the cathedral. She was in a room with a man who had just said, effectively, that what happened to her house would not go unanswered, who had stood in front of 700 nobles and informed them that she was now protected without using words, without theater, with only the flat, devastating certainty of someone who had decided it and expected reality to comply. She did not know yet what to do with this. It was too new, too complicated, had too many edges she hadn't mapped. She filed it in the place where she kept things that required more information before she could assess them accurately. "Dinner will be at the usual hour?" she asked, because it was a manageable question with a known answer. "Yes," he said, and she could hear in the single syllable that he understood exactly what she was doing. She went back to the library. She sat at the reading table for a while without reading anything. She thought about her father. She thought about the letter. She thought about the quality of attention of a man who had fought campaigns that historians couldn't agree on and had margin notes in books she'd already read. Then she opened the ledger to the 4th page, found the notation that didn't match the summary, traced it back through 3 pages of cross-referenced entries, and located the error. A clerk's transposition in the Eastern accounts that had compounded over 2 quarters into a discrepancy significant enough to affect the spring planning budget. She corrected it, noted the correction, and started on the next ledger. She was on the 2nd page when she heard it. Not a sound from the hall, not from the courtyard. A sound from further off, the road, she realized after a moment. Horses coming fast. Too many horses for a normal courier, too fast for a scheduled dispatch. She went to the window. 6 riders in the Emperor's colors, moving at the pace of people who had been told not to stop. She saw Cassian in the courtyard below, saw him register the riders, saw him become very still in the particular way she had begun to recognize as dangerous. The lead rider pulled up at the courtyard gate. She was too far to hear the words, but she saw Cassian take the document the rider extended. She saw him read it. She saw what happened to his face. Whatever was in that document was not an audit. It was not a lever, not a pressure point, not the kind of political communication you could navigate around. Whatever was in that document was something that had moved the game into a different register entirely. He looked up from the document and directly at the window where she was standing. It was not possible that he could see her clearly at that distance, but he looked directly at her, with an expression she had never seen on him. Not the controlled nothing of the cathedral, not the recalibrating attention of the library. Something stripped back. Something that did not have room for management or performance or the careful neutral surface he wore over everything else. Then he looked away. He gave an order. The soldiers in the courtyard moved. She stepped back from the window. Whatever had just arrived in that rider's hands, it had changed something. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. Through the air pressure, through something deeper than sound. 3 weeks at Blackthorn had taught her the rhythms of this place, and what she felt now was all of those rhythms altering simultaneously, the whole complex machinery of the keep shifting into a different mode. She went to the door of the library, opened it. In the corridor, Marin was already moving toward her with the expression of a woman who has prepared herself for the conversation she is about to have. "What is it?" Selene asked. Marin looked at her with, for the first time, something that was not assessment, but direct, unguarded communication. "The Emperor," she said, "has issued a warrant for the arrest of House Ravaryn's surviving heir." The surviving heir was her. There was only her. "On what charge?" she asked, and her voice was exactly as steady as she needed it to be. "Treason," Marin said. The word landed in the corridor and sat there. In the courtyard below, through the heavy stone walls, she could hear Cassian giving orders. She could not make out the words, but she could hear the quality of his voice, the voice that had given orders in places where orders determined who lived and who didn't, and the recognition that whatever it was saying, it was not the voice of a man preparing to comply. This is a work of complete fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary. She did not run. That was the first thing she decided, standing in the corridor with Marin's words still sitting in the cold air between them. Treason. The word that the Empire used when it wanted something from someone who hadn't committed anything. She knew its architecture. She had watched it dismantle her father over 3 years, slowly, methodically, the way you drain a well. Not all at once, because all at once would be obvious, but incrementally, until the morning you reach down and find nothing left. She had been 14 when they started on her father. She was 22 now. 8 years was a long time to study a thing without being able to stop it. "How long before the warrant is active?" she asked. Marin looked at her with revised attention. The revision of someone recalculating what kind of person they are dealing with. The riders carry the instrument. It's active now. Then I need to speak with him. He's in the war room. I know where he is, Selene said, and walked. The war room was on the second level of the North Tower, and it was exactly what the name said. Not a strategy chamber dressed up in the language of war, but a room that had been built for the actual work of it. Maps on every surface. A campaign table with weighted markers. One window, narrow, positioned for sightlines rather than light. The room smelled of old candle wax and something metallic she couldn't identify and didn't try to. Cassian was at the table. Two of his senior officers, Renveld and an older man named Aldrich, whom she'd seen in the courtyard but not formally met, stood at opposite sides. All three of them looked up when she came through the door. Renveld's expression said she shouldn't be here. Aldrich's expression said nothing, which meant he was reserving judgment, which meant he was smarter than Renveld. Cassian said nothing at all. He looked at her and waited. She came to the table. Show me the warrant. Selene, show me the document. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he slid it across the table. She read it. She read it the way her father had taught her to read legal instruments, not for the words, but for the structure. Because the words were always dressed to mislead, but the structure told you what the thing actually was. What it was, in this case, was a seizure instrument. The treason charge was a mechanism, not a conviction. A charge pending investigation, which in imperial legal language meant a charge that would remain pending until whatever political purpose it served had been resolved. What it authorized, in practical terms, was the detention of the named party, her, pending the resolution of an inquiry that had no specified timeline and no specified evidentiary threshold. She put the document down. They don't want me detained, she said. They want you managed. Neither officer spoke. Cassian was watching her. If they wanted me detained, they'd have sent more riders, she continued. 6 riders is enough to deliver a warrant and enough to make a show of it, but it's not enough to enforce it against a garrison of 400. They're not expecting enforcement. They're expecting negotiation. Aldrich cleared his throat. It was not a dismissive sound. It was the sound of a man acknowledging that a point had been made. She's right, he said to Cassian. Cassian did not look at Aldrich. He was still looking at her. What do they want from the negotiation? Me, eventually, she said flatly. That's the end game. But the opening position is probably compliance, some acknowledgement that the Emperor's authority reaches into the north, that your loyalty has a ceiling, that you can be moved. They'll take the smallest thing they can get that still means something. She paused. The warrant is the price of the conversation. If you want to make it go away through ordinary channels, you give them something, access probably, or a show of obedience. I don't, Cassian said, do shows of obedience. The air in the room changed slightly. Renveld shifted his weight. Aldrich went very still in the particular way of experienced soldiers when they understand that the person speaking has just committed to a direction and the room is orienting around it. Selene looked at him. Then you need to understand what you're choosing instead, she said. I do understand it. Tell me. The silence was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who had been doing a very careful accounting of each other for 3 weeks and were now arriving at the actual question. War, he said. One word, no inflection, delivered the way you state the weather. Yes, she said. War. Does that change anything for you? He asked. It was a genuine question. She could hear the genuine in it. Not the solicitation of permission, but the actual question of a man who wanted information he could factor in. She thought about her father's iron ring on her right hand. She thought about the ward mother's cold pity. She thought about 6 years of being carefully preserved in a state of managed helplessness. No, she said, it doesn't. Something shifted in his face. That thing she'd been cataloging, the off-center, unguarded thing that appeared when she gave him an answer he hadn't calculated for. It lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3, and then his face returned to its operational surface. He looked at Aldrich. Send the riders back with the standard response. Aldrich raised one eyebrow a fraction of a centimeter. Standard response, my lord. Tell the Emperor, Cassian said. that the warrant has been received and logged, that it will be reviewed by Northern Legal Counsel in accordance with the standard 30-day review period, that the Duke thanks His Imperial Majesty for his continued communication. He paused. And tell them the roads are clear. Aldrich understood. Selene understood. Renveld, after a moment, understood. The roads being clear meant your 6 riders can leave without incident, which also meant, by implication, that they might not have been able to otherwise, which told the Emperor's court in precise language exactly what the Duke thought of the warrant without saying it in terms that could be cited. Aldrich left. Renveld left. She turned to go. Ravaryn. She stopped. You're not being sent back, he said. She turned around. He was still at the table, one hand flat on the surface beside the maps, not looking at the warrant anymore, but not looking away from her either. The firelight in the war room was doing what firelight did in rooms with stone walls and small windows, making everything sharper and everything more honest than it meant to be. I know, she said, because she did know, and she had known it since she'd seen his face through the window in the courtyard, but she needed to hear him say it in a room with no officers present. They'll come back with something harder, he said. Yes. You know that. I've known what they are for 8 years, she said. I spent 6 of them being grateful they'd stopped at my father. The thing behind his eyes went somewhere very specific. He looked at her with the same quality of attention she'd first seen in the cathedral, but stripped of whatever layers he'd had around it then. It was a look that required something she didn't entirely know what to do with yet. Not comfort, not performance, just presence, and the specific discomfort of being seen without the buffer of being underestimated. I'll need to know, he said, everything about your father's affairs, the contracts, the debts, the people involved, everything they can use. I'll write it down, she said. Tonight. Tonight, she agreed and walked out of the war room and felt, in the corridor, the distinct and unfamiliar sensation of being on the right side of something dangerous. Not safe. She was not under any illusions about safe, but aligned, moving in a direction that had been chosen rather than assigned. Time. She wrote for 4 hours. Everything she remembered about her father's business affairs, which was more than most people would have expected her to know, because she had been 16 when the empire started its compression, and her father, understanding what was happening, had told her everything on the logic that if it came apart entirely, she should at least know the shape of what had been lost. She wrote the names of the contracts, the names of the officials who had withdrawn them, the specific sequence of financial pressure, the timing, the pattern of it. She wrote the name of the man her father had believed was responsible for the initial report that had made him a target. She had never said this name aloud. She had kept it in a place inside her where she kept things too expensive to spend until she knew what she was spending them on. She wrote it down now. Commissioner Aldous Thorne, Northern Revenue Division, appointed 3rd year of Emperor Lucian's reign. She folded the papers and slid them under his door before midnight, because there was no point in waiting. Better. She was in the library the next morning when Marin brought her tea and said, without preamble, "The Duke requests your presence at the morning meal." Selene looked up from the ledger. In 3 weeks, she had not eaten at the main table with him. She had taken meals in the smaller dining room off the kitchen, which was warmer anyway and required less performance. The invitation was new information. "The main hall?" she asked. "His private dining room," Marin said, "off the east corridor." She went. The private dining room was small. 4 chairs, 1 window, a fire that had been burning long enough to have made the room actually warm rather than merely heated. Cassian was already there with the folded papers she'd written. He did not put them away when she entered. He was reading the last page. She sat down across from him. Food was on the table. She poured her own tea. He finished reading, folded the papers, set them down with the specific care of someone handling something that has value. "Thorne," he said. "Yes." "You're certain." "My father was certain," she said. "I'm certain of his certainty, which is the most I can honestly claim." He picked up his cup, set it down without drinking. "Thorne died 2 years ago," he said. She processed this. "Of what?" "According to official record, fever." He said it without inflection. She looked at him. He looked back. There was a specific gravity in the space between them, the weight of a coincidence that was not a coincidence, and neither of them addressed it directly, because some things were better left as implication, better left in the space where you could each understand without it needing to be said. Then whoever acted on his report is still active, she said finally. Yes. And whoever that is has an interest in making sure the Ravaryn file stays open. Yes, he paused. The file doesn't close if you're detained. It closes if you're dead. The word landed on the table between them with the particular weight of things stated plainly that should perhaps have been softened but weren't. And weren't because he was not a man who softened things, and because she had spent 6 years surrounded by people who softened things right up until those things killed someone. I know, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. You're not afraid, he said. It was not quite an observation and not quite a question. I'm afraid, she said. I'm just more afraid of the alternative. Which is? Going back, she said, being managed, waiting to be used. She looked at the window. Outside, the northern hills were doing their morning thing, gray and real and completely uninterested in being anything other than exactly what they were. 6 years of that is enough of a baseline. At least here something might actually happen. He made a sound she'd never heard from him before. It was short, not quite a laugh, but in the same family as one. A sound of a man who has heard something that registered as true in a way he hadn't expected. He covered it immediately, returned to his operational face, lifted his cup. Eat, he said. And it was not an order exactly. It was the voice of someone who has decided something and is moving forward from having decided it. She ate. He ate. They did not speak for a while, and the silence was the most comfortable silence she'd had in 6 years, which was information she filed without knowing yet what to do with. It was the 3rd week when the capital's next move arrived. Not in riders this time, but in an invitation. Imperial Court Assembly, the first of the winter season. Attendance expected from all major houses. The Duke of the Northern Reach and his wife were formally requested to present themselves at the capital within 20 days. Cassian read it at the situation table. She stood beside him and read it over his shoulder, which she'd started doing in the 2nd week because she'd realized he never told her to stop, and because reading things herself was faster than being told about them. They're not done maneuvering, she said. No. If you refuse the invitation, it becomes a different kind of conflict. I know. If you attend, they have access to me in their space. I know that too. She looked at the invitation. The seal was the imperial gold, not the administrative green, personal, direct, from the emperor's office. That meant Lucien had signed it himself or had someone sign it in his name that he intended to stand behind. Either way, it was a signal. The preliminary moves were done. Whatever came next would be in the open. She said, You're going to attend. He put the invitation down. We're going to attend. They'll try something at the assembly. Yes. Something more direct than a warrant. He looked at her, and what she saw on his face was not the recalibrating look, or the library look, or the war room look. It was something older and more straightforward. The face of a man who has been in enough rooms where something direct happened that he no longer found the prospect surprising, had stopped finding it surprising so long ago that the absence of surprise had calcified into something else entirely. Something that looked from the outside like certainty. Let them, he said. They rode south 12 days later. The party was larger this time. 40 soldiers in Valecrest colors, the full formal escort, the statement of it unmistakable. She rode beside him for the first full day, which was the first time they had been in that configuration for an extended period, and she noticed that the soldiers around them adjusted their formation without being told, creating space that was respectful without being symbolic. They had decided something about her, she realized, not because of anything political, because of the stores, because of the conflicting orders, because of the small, unglamorous work of someone who saw what needed doing and did it without requiring credit. On the second day, riding through a narrow valley pass, he said, "How much do you know about Lady Vesperine?" She had been waiting for this. "Enough," she said. "Tell me the enough." Imperial cousin. Third remove, but she's managed it well. She's been at court since she was 15, and she understands the architecture of influence better than most of the people who have actual structural power. She's been positioned as a potential match for 3 different noble houses in the past 6 years and has managed to remain unmatched, which means she's decided that influence at court is worth more than a title elsewhere. She paused. She was mentioned twice in letters from a wards administrator as someone who had expressed interest in the Ravaryn situation. He was quiet for a moment. Expressed interest how? The letters didn't say, which means the interest was the kind that doesn't want to be specified. He looked at the road ahead. The valley walls on either side were high and close, the kind of terrain that made experienced soldiers uncomfortable because of what it implied about sightlines. His hand was near his pommel. She noticed this was habitual, not a gesture of threat, but a placement, a man keeping his options within reach. "When we arrive," he said, "you don't go anywhere without either me or 2 of the Northern Guard." "I know." "I'm not asking." "I know that too," she said. He looked at her. Something moved in that look. The same quality she'd seen after she'd defended the soldier who brought her the village information, but closer now and less contained. He held it for a second longer than usual, then returned to the road. She thought, in the silence that followed, about something she had not allowed herself to think directly until now. Not about survival, not about the empire, not about warrants and invitations and political architecture. About the library margin notes she had finally read the previous evening. Careful, economical observations in the margins of a military history. The kind written by someone who is genuinely arguing with the text, rather than annotating it for show. The historians claim that the Crenny campaign had succeeded through brutality. The margin note beside it, in that tight hand, not brutality, certainty. The difference matters. She had sat with those 4 words for a long time. She understood now what the difference was. She had watched it operate for 3 weeks. She had watched a man who had every reason to be brutal, every excuse that history and violence and survival could manufacture, operate instead from a kind of absolute clarity about what he was protecting and what it cost and what he was willing to pay. That clarity looked like brutality from a distance. From close range, it was something else. She was not certain yet what to call it. She kept the question in the place where she kept things that needed more information. The valley widened ahead. The road opened back into flat farmland, and in the far distance the first towers of the capital were visible against the winter sky, pale and intricate and full of people who were expecting something specific from the arrival of the Archduke and his plain, unfortunate wife. She looked at those towers and thought, they're expecting what they've always expected. They're expecting him to be what they've decided he is. What they were not expecting, she was increasingly certain, was her. The capital's gates were still 2 days out, and inside those gates something was already moving. She could feel it the way you feel a storm, in the pressure of the air before a drop of rain falls. Lady Vesperine was at court. Emperor Lucien was at court. And somewhere in the administrative layers of imperial power, the name Aldous Thorne connected to someone who was still alive and still invested in making sure certain files stayed open and certain people stayed manageable. She rode and she thought, and she kept her father's ring solid and real on her hand, and she did not let herself imagine outcomes, because outcomes were the province of people who had the luxury of hoping. She stayed in the present, in the motion of the horse beneath her, in the cold of the northern air following them south, in the specific and undeniable reality of 40 soldiers in dark colors, and the man beside her who had told an emperor's warrant that it would receive a standard 30-day review, and had meant every word of it. She was not going back. That was the only certainty she allowed herself. She did not know yet that certainty was about to cost them everything. The gates of Vareth Prime were open, which they always were during assembly season, and the road through the merchant quarter was wide enough for the party to ride without compression. And none of this meant anything except that the city had decided to be polite about it before it was something else. Selene rode at Cassian's left and watched the city watch them and catalogued what she saw. People who stopped to look and people who deliberately did not stop to look, which was its own kind of looking. The Valecrest banner was recognized. She could see it in the way certain faces changed. Not to fear exactly, but to the specific recalibration of people who had heard a name many times and were now updating the abstraction with a physical reality. The imperial guest quarters were in the eastern residential wing of the palace complex, comfortable, well-appointed, positioned so that the windows faced the interior garden rather than the street, which meant that everything you could see from those rooms was controlled. She noticed this. She said nothing about it. Their rooms were adjacent, not shared. This had been arranged by the palace staff according to some logic she did not investigate. She unpacked the single trunk she'd brought with the same efficiency she applied to everything and stood at the controlled window and looked at the controlled garden and thought about the next 36 hours, which was how much time they had before the assembly began. Aldrich knocked on the connecting door at the second hour. "There's a visitor," he said when she opened it, "for the Duke, but he's asked that you be present." She went through. The visitor was a man she didn't know. Middle 50s, imperial administrative dress, the kind of unremarkable face that had been cultivated into unremarkability through years of practice. He sat with the posture of someone who had delivered difficult information many times and had developed a system for it. He stood when she entered. He looked at Cassian. "My lord," he said, "I'll be brief, because the window for this conversation is short." Cassian was standing near the window. He had not sat down since arriving in the capital, she'd noticed. He stood in rooms here the way he never stood at Blackthorn, with the particular tension of a man operating in territory that was not his and that he did not intend to let forget it. "Then be brief," Cassian said. "The warrant on the Duchess is a secondary instrument," the man said. "The primary objective, the one that has been in motion for approximately 4 months, is the seizure of the Northern Trade Licensing Authority. The treason charge creates grounds for the imperial administration to appoint a crown receiver to manage Northern revenue pending investigation. The receiver's mandate would supersede the Duke's authority over Northern contracts for the duration of the inquiry." Cassian said nothing. His face said nothing. The room said nothing. "The assembly session 2 days from now," the man continued, "includes a scheduled administrative review of Northern licensing documentation. The documentation was submitted to the Imperial Archives 6 weeks ago by a House representative. The submission is, in several respects, irregular." "Whose House representative?" Cassian said. The man hesitated 1 second too long. "Whose?" Cassian said, and the single word had a different quality this time. Not louder, not harder, but denser, the way certain materials become denser under pressure, rather than softer. "The submission was made under the seal of your Northern Affairs Secretary," the man said. "Aldous Grain." The name landed in the room and did what names do when they are the last name you expected. It reconfigured everything that had seemed stable. Selene watched Cassian's face for the reconfiguration and saw almost nothing, which was worse than seeing something, because it meant he was holding it behind a surface that had been trained for exactly this kind of impact and was still holding. Aldrich, standing by the door, had gone very still. Aldous Grain. She knew the name from the keep. She had not interacted with him directly. He worked in the estate offices, handled the Northern contracts and the licensing documentation, had been at Blackthorn for 11 years, longer than Marin, longer than most of the garrison. "You're certain of the seal," Cassian said. "I've seen the document myself," the man said. "It bears his seal and a counter-signature I cannot identify." "Why are you telling me this?" Cassian said. The man looked at him steadily. "Because what they're planning to do with your house is something that should not be done in the dark," he said. "That's all the reason I'm willing to give." Cassian looked at him for a long moment. Whatever he was calculating, it ran deep and ran fast and reached a conclusion she couldn't see. "You'll need to not be found to have had this conversation," he said. "I'm aware." "Then go." The man went. The door closed, and the room held the specific silence of something that had just changed shape. Selene looked at Cassian. He was still at the window, and he was doing the thing she had identified as the most dangerous version of his stillness. The version that was not waiting but arriving, the version that preceded decisions rather than following them. "Grain," she said. "Yes." 11 years. "Yes." The word was flat in a way that told her everything about what 11 years meant. She did not say, "I'm sorry," because it was not the right instrument for the moment. She said, Where is he now? At the keep. Cassian moved from the window. The movement was precise and without waste, the movement of a man converting from stillness to action with nothing in between. Aldrich. Aldrich stepped forward. He had the expression of a soldier receiving an order he had already prepared himself to receive. Dispatch to the keep tonight. Find Grain. Don't let him know he's been found. Watch what he does and who he communicates with. He paused. Quietly. My lord, Aldrich said, and left. She stood in the room with him and thought about 11 years. She thought about what it meant to trust someone 11 years, to have them inside your household and your accounts and your legal documentation for 11 years, and then to find that trust had been a tunnel they had been digging the whole time. She thought about what it did to a person to discover that proximity was not the same as loyalty, that the people closest to you occupied a position that was valuable precisely because it could not be surveilled, and that some people understood this and made use of it. She thought about her father's documents, the specific irregularities that had started the Empire's compression, how clean it had seemed, how like a sequence of unfortunate coincidences, until you understood that coincidences of that particular precision didn't assemble themselves. He gave them the documentation, she said, the original Ravaryn trading contracts. That's how the inquiry started. That's the countersignature. Cassian looked at her. He's been feeding it from the inside for 4 months, she said. Maybe longer. The warrant on me wasn't the opening move. It was the notification that the groundwork was finished. He held her gaze. The look on his face was not surprise. He was already where she had arrived, had probably arrived there 30 seconds faster. What was on his face was something older than surprise. The specific expression of a man who has been betrayed before, not recently, but formatively, in the places where betrayal takes up permanent residence, and who has built everything since around not being in that position again, and has just discovered that the architecture was insufficient. It lasted 3 seconds, then it closed. The assembly session, he said. Can they proceed without my presence? Administratively, yes, she said. The documentation is already in the archive. If the session convenes and the irregularities are presented in your absence, the imperial administrator can move to appoint the receiver on an emergency basis. Your presence complicates it, but it doesn't prevent it. What does prevent it? She thought for a moment. Demonstrating that the documentation was submitted fraudulently, which requires Grain's testimony or the countersignature identified. A pause. Or demonstrating that the documentation itself is internally inconsistent, that it was altered. You've read the Northern licensing records. The public ledgers, not the contract documentation. He crossed to the travel case on the side table and opened it. Inside, in a leather document sleeve, was a set of papers she had not known were there. He handed them to her. She looked at the cover sheet. Copies of the Northern licensing contracts. Originals. She could tell by the paper quality, not duplicates. He had brought them. He had anticipated, or at minimum prepared for, the possibility that the documentation would become contested. She looked up at him. Read them tonight, he said. Find what's different. She took the papers. She went back to her room and lit every candle she had and spread the documents across the bed and did not sleep. The banquet was the following evening. It was framed as an informal gathering before the assembly session, a social occasion, attendance expected, the kind of event that was called informal specifically because calling it mandatory would have been impolite. The great reception hall of the imperial palace was warm and lit, and full of people performing the particular theater of a court that was watching 2 things simultaneously: the Duke of the Northern Reach, who had arrived with 40 soldiers, and a posture that communicated his opinion of the invitation clearly, and his wife, who had arrived in a dark gray dress with her father's iron ring on her right hand, and an expression that several noble women would later describe, variously, as composed, cold, and unsettling. Selene had found what was different in the documents. It had taken 4 hours. There were 3 alterations, small, technical, buried in the administrative language of the licensing authority clauses, that changed the jurisdictional framework in ways that would not be visible to someone not specifically looking for them. Someone had access to the original documents, and had altered them before the copies were submitted to the Imperial Archive. The alterations were good work, not perfect work. Perfect enough to pass a routine review, but not careful enough to survive scrutiny from someone who had read the originals. She had written down the specific discrepancies in a tight, precise notation. She had folded the paper and put it in the bodice of her dress because there was no pocket and because it needed to stay on her. Cassian stood at the edge of the reception hall with a cup he had not drunk from and watched the room with the comprehensive attention of someone mapping terrain. She stood at his left side and did the same thing, which she had learned in 6 years was more useful than conversation at events like this. Lady Vesperine found them at the 40-minute mark. She was exactly what Selene had constructed from the descriptions. Precise, put together, in the way of someone for whom appearance was active work rather than passive maintenance, with eyes that did the actual looking while the rest of her face performed something warmer. She was perhaps 35. She moved through the room with the specific ease of someone who owned it without the title to it. She addressed Cassian first, which was the correct formal order, and also Attell. She looked at him first not from deference, but from assessment, the way you check the primary variable before everything else. "My Lord Valecrest," she said. "It's been some time." "Lady Vesperine," Cassian said. His voice was exactly what it always was. She turned to Selene. The look was brief and thorough and covered in warmth. "And the Duchess, I've heard so much." "I imagine," Selene said. Something flickered in Vesperine's eyes, the slight recalibration of someone who expected a different register and received a flat one instead. It was gone in under a second. "You've settled well into northern life, I understand," she said to Selene. "Quite the adjustment from the wards." "Most things are an adjustment from the wards," Selene said. "That's not a high bar." Cassian said nothing. He was watching Vesperine with the specific quality of attention he'd given the warrant, reading structure rather than surface. "The session tomorrow should be interesting," Vesperine said, returning to Cassian with the ease of a woman changing lanes on a familiar road. "Administrative matters are so rarely dramatic, and yet somehow this one has generated considerable conversation." "Administrative matters," Cassian said, "tend to generate conversation when they're designed to." A pause. The warmth on Vesperine's face did not change. It was, Selene realized, not an expression. It was a surface, maintained with the consistency of something structural. "You'll find the process is entirely standard," she said. "The Imperial Archive handles these reviews routinely." "Then it'll be routine," Cassian said. Vesperine held his gaze for one more second. Then she smiled, genuine this time, which was more unsettling than the performed version, and moved away into the room. Selene said quietly, "She's not running it." "No," Cassian said. "She's the visibility. Someone else has the documentation." "Yes." She thought about who that someone was. She thought about Grain's counter-signature, still unidentified. She thought about 4 months and 11 years and the specific patience of people who built things slowly because they understood that slow things were harder to see. She was still thinking about it when the wine was brought around and she declined hers, and the server moved on and she registered half a second later something slightly wrong about the way the server had looked at her when she declined. Not disappointed. Servers don't express disappointment. Something else. Something brisk and functional that moved off too fast. She looked at the cup she had not taken. The server was already across the room. She turned to Cassian and said very quietly, "Don't drink yours." He looked at her. She looked at the server. He followed her gaze to where the man had stopped near a column, had set down his tray, and was watching the room with the specific attention of someone waiting for a result. Cassian set his cup on the nearest table without looking at it. He said, still quiet, "Aldrich." Aldrich materialized from 3 feet behind them, with the readiness of a man who had been close all evening. "My lord." "The server by the east column." Aldrich looked back. "I see him." "Before he leaves the room." Aldrich moved. He moved in the way of someone who had done this enough times that it looked like ordinary navigation. A man crossing a room at a banquet, unhurried, nothing notable. He reached the server by the column. There was a brief exchange she couldn't hear. The server tried to leave and did not leave. The room continued around this. Nobody noticed. That was the specific skill of courts. They conducted their actual business inside the performance of sociality, and the performance never acknowledged the actual business. She looked at Cassian. His face was doing the dense, pressurized stillness again. He was looking at the server with an expression that she now understood completely. It was not anger, which would have been something to release. It was the face of a man filing information in a place where it would be permanent. A man who had learned long ago that anger was expensive and memory was free. "How did you know?" he said. "His face when I declined," she said. "It was too quick, too finished." He looked at her with that off-center thing she'd been cataloging for 3 weeks, except this time it was closer than it had ever been and had nothing careful around it. Just the look, direct and unfiltered, the look of a man standing in a room where someone has just done something for him that he did not ask for and did not expect and does not have a prepared response to. "Selene," he said. She had not heard him use her name before. Not once in 3 weeks, not once on the road, not in the war room, or the library, or the private dining room. She had been Ravaryn. She had been she. She had been the understood subject of sentences that didn't require her name because he'd been treating her name as a thing he hadn't decided to use yet. She looked at him. He started to say something. She could see it begin. Something that would have cost him, that would have required a different kind of vocabulary than he generally operated in. Words from the undefended register rather than the operational one. The doors to the reception hall opened. 4 imperial guards. Behind them, in the formal dress of an administrative function, a man she didn't recognize with a document in his hands. Behind him, with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a particular moment and has arrived at it, Lady Vesperine. The room noise dropped by half. Courts felt gravity shifts before they understood them. The man with the document looked at Cassian. He did not look at Selene because she was not, in this moment, the primary variable. "My Lord Valecrest," he said, with the flat courtesy of an official performing a function he would prefer not to have to repeat. "By order of Emperor Lucien, in accordance with the Imperial Administrative Code and pending the outcome of tomorrow's assembly session, the Duchess Selene Ravaryn Valecrest is hereby placed under protective custody within the palace grounds." The silence was complete. "On what additional grounds?" Cassian said, and his voice was the same as it always was, and that was the most frightening thing in the room. "Information has come to the Imperial Administration indicating that the Duchess may be at risk of harm from northern separatist elements," the man said. "The protective custody is for her security." It was beautifully constructed. Selene recognized the architecture immediately. Not a threat, not an arrest, but protection. Imperial protection, which meant imperial control, which meant she was being moved out of Cassian's reach in a language that made him the potential source of danger if he resisted. If he refused, he was refusing her protection. If he complied, she was gone. She looked at Cassian. His jaw had set in a way she hadn't seen before. Not anger, something below anger, the structural thing that anger was built on top of. His hand had moved to his pommel. 40 soldiers in the city. 4 guards in this room, plus whatever was outside those doors. 500 witnesses in a room that reported to an emperor. She understood what he was calculating. She understood it because she had spent 6 years learning to calculate the same thing in rooms with worse odds and less to protect. She put her hand on his arm. He went very still. Stiller than the cathedral, stiller than the war room, stiller than she had seen him be. He looked down at her hand on his arm. "It's all right," she said. It was not all right. They both knew it was not all right. But she said it the way her father had said things in the last 2 years of his life that were not true but needed to be said because the alternative was what it cost to say nothing. She looked at him, and she held his gaze for 3 full seconds, and she put every piece of what she understood into that look. The document discrepancies in her bodice, the counter-signature, the pattern of it, everything she had spent 4 hours cataloging by candlelight. She could not say any of it. She said it with her eyes and trusted him to read it. His jaw worked once. His hand moved away from the pommel. She turned to the official. "I'll come," she said, and her voice was exactly as steady as she needed it to be, which was steadier than she felt, which was the only kind of steadiness that mattered. They walked her out of the reception hall. At the door, she looked back once. Cassian was standing exactly where she'd left him, in the middle of the room, surrounded by 500 people who had just watched him let them take his wife, and on his face was an expression that none of them in that room had ever seen on the Archduke before. It was not defeat. It was not grief, not exactly. It was the expression of a man who has found, for the first time in a very long time, something he is not willing to calculate the cost of losing, and who has just been shown, in full and in public, that this is the thing they intend to use against him. The doors closed. She was on the other side of them, in the corridor, flanked by imperial guards, walking toward whatever they had prepared for her. And behind those doors she knew, in the way that you know the things you have staked everything on being right about, that the Archduke was done calculating. He stood in the reception hall for exactly 4 minutes after the doors closed. Not because he was uncertain, because he was doing the kind of thinking that required stillness, the deep, structural accounting that preceded campaigns, that preceded every decision he had ever made that could not be unmade. Around him the hall had resumed its theater. Voices had returned, careful and low, the specific pitch of people performing normalcy over something that had shaken them. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody came within 10 feet of him. The court understood, on some animal level that preceded social calculation, that the Archduke was not currently available for conversation. Aldrich appeared at his shoulder. "The server," he said very quietly, "employed through a private catering contractor. Contract arranged 6 weeks ago through an intermediary we have not yet identified. He's not talking." "He doesn't need to talk," Cassian said. "We know what it was. My lord, if they attempt tonight, they won't tonight." Cassian turned from the doors. Tonight was the warrant made physical. They need her alive for the assembly session, or the receiver appointment has no legitimate instrument. The treason charge requires a named party in custody, not a dead one. Aldrich processed this. "Then we have until the session." "We have until the session." He moved toward the hall exit, not the main doors where the guards had taken Selene, but the servants' corridor on the west side that he had mapped on arrival, because mapping exits was a habit he had not survived this long by abandoning. "Get me the floor plan of the palace's lower levels." "I'll need an hour." "You have 30 minutes. He walked into the corridor and the door closed behind him, and he was alone for the first time since the doors had shut with her on the other side of them. And he let himself have exactly 10 seconds of the thing he would not show in any room with another person in it. Not grief. Grief was for after. Not rage. Rage was a weather system, useful when channeled, catastrophic when ambient. What he let himself have was the cold, absolute recognition of what he had permitted to happen, and what it meant, and what it was going to require to correct. He had built his life, everything after the wreckage that had preceded his life, the Empire's first accounting with his family, the losses that had taught him that attachment was a structural vulnerability, around the principle that nothing should matter enough to be used against him. He had been right about the principle. He had applied it correctly for 20 years. He had simply failed to account for the specific way that principles become irrelevant when the variable changes. And Selene Ravaryn had changed the variable so quietly and so completely that by the time he understood what had happened, the Empire had already identified it and moved. He had watched her read that warrant and tell him what it meant before he'd finished reading it himself. He had watched her find the discrepancy in a licensing document that his own legal staff had not flagged. He had watched her, in the middle of a banquet designed to end her, notice a server's face and understand it in under a second and put her hand on his arm and save him from doing something that would have gotten them both killed faster than the poison would have. And then they had walked her out, and he had let them because she had told him to with her eyes, and he had understood what she was telling him, and he had done it. And it was the hardest thing he had done since Krenna, and Krenna had cost him things he had never recovered. 10 seconds. Then he moved. The floor plans arrived in 22 minutes, delivered by a palace servant Aldrich had cultivated. Not bought, cultivated, which was different, which meant the loyalty was genuine and therefore reliable. Cassian spread them on the small table in the servants' antechamber. He'd appropriated and read them the way he read terrain. Not for the rooms, but for the spaces between the rooms, the logic of the structure, the places a building's function required passages that its ceremony pretended didn't exist. The palace's lower levels were administrative and utilitarian, storage, records, the functional infrastructure of running an imperial court. Below them, older. the kind of old that predated the current dynasty. Stone corridors that had served different purposes under different rulers and had been sealed off and partially repurposed and never fully mapped by the current administration because the current administration had not needed to map them. They'd used the upper guest wing for something official, he said, visible. The protective custody framing requires visibility. If she disappears into the underbelly, the story collapses. Aldrich leaned over the map. East wing, second floor. The rooms there are used for sensitive detentions. Good visibility, good security, close enough to the throne room to demonstrate imperial oversight. Cassian looked at the East Wing's position on the map. 2 main access points. 1 servants' corridor running parallel that terminated at a locked junction. The junction's position relative to the exterior wall. The exterior wall's relationship to the eastern garden she could see from her window. The controlled garden. The garden designed to communicate that everything visible was managed. The garden wall, he said. Aldrich followed his gaze. Said nothing for a moment. That's a 12-foot exterior wall with a sentry rotation. I know what it is. My lord, if they catch you on that wall, if they catch me on that wall, Cassian said, the war starts tonight instead of tomorrow. He looked at Aldrich. Send the message north. Tell them to be ready to move. Aldrich's expression did not change. It was the expression of a man who had followed his lord through worse decisions than this and had made his peace with all of them. It'll take 3 days for a full mobilization. Then send it now, and we have 3 days. He began folding the map. Where is Renveld? Outside with the guard. Tell him I need 6 men, quietly. No colors. What? The night was cold, the way northern nights were cold. With intention, without apology. The Eastern Garden's exterior wall was old stone, the same material as the keep at Blackthorn, and it had the same quality of something that had been absorbing weather for a long time and had opinions about it. Cassian went over it without a sound, because silence was a skill he had learned before he learned to read, in a house that required it, in a childhood that had been training for exactly these kinds of walls, whether or not it had known that at the time. The sentry rotation had a 40-second gap on the northeast corner. Aldrich had timed it. The gap existed because the 2 sentries' patrol routes overlapped awkwardly, and neither had been told to correct it, which meant the gap had probably existed for months, and neither sentry thought of it as a gap because it was simply the way they had always done it. He dropped into the garden, cold gravel under his boots. The east wing rose ahead of him, lit from within, 3 stories of controlled visibility. He found the servants' corridor entrance at ground level. A plain wooden door, locked with the kind of lock that the palace considered adequate, because the people who needed to consider it adequate had never tested it under the right conditions. He was inside in 40 seconds. The servants' corridor was narrow and utilitarian and smelled of old stone and lamp oil. He moved through it with the specific pace of someone who understands that speed and silence are not the same thing, and that choosing between them is a judgment call made by the quality of the floor under your feet. Old stone floors telegraphed sound differently than wood. He had learned this at 17 in a campaign he was not supposed to be part of and had been part of anyway. He found the junction. It led into the main east wing corridor at a service door. He stood at the door for a moment and listened to the other side. 2 guards. He could place them by footfall, the weight and rhythm of 2 men standing in the particular way of people assigned to a door who are not expecting company. He thought about Selene's handwriting, the tight, precise notation of someone who had been writing in circumstances that required brevity and accuracy, who had learned that words cost something and used them accordingly. He thought about 4 hours of candlelight and 3 contract discrepancies and a folded piece of paper in a gray dress. He opened the door. The first guard turned and did not finish turning. The second had 2 seconds to register what was happening. 2 seconds was not enough. Cassian had them both against the wall before either had made a sound that would carry, and what he said to them was quiet and entirely sincere. The room at the end of this corridor. Tell me the number. The first guard told him. Room 14, East Wing, 2nd floor. He left them with their weapons missing and their ability to raise an alarm temporarily compromised and moved down the corridor, and the part of him that had fought in Krenny and before Krenna and in every ugly necessary place that the historians wrote about, with the words that didn't capture what it actually felt like, was running on the deep, competent autopilot of a man who is no longer thinking about what he is doing because thinking about it is slower than doing it. Room 14. The door was locked from the outside, which told him everything about what protective custody actually meant. He knocked. 2 knocks. Pause. 1. The sequence he had not established with her in advance because there had not been time to establish it, but that he used anyway because it was better than nothing, and because some part of him knew, with the irrational certainty of a man who has been paying attention for 3 weeks, that she would understand a pattern when she heard one. A pause. Then, from inside, her voice, low, controlled, exactly as steady as she needed it to be. "Who's there?" "Open the door," he said, "or stand back from it." 3 seconds of silence, then, "Stand back from it." He took the lock apart. It was a better lock than the garden entrance, but not better enough. He pushed the door open. She was standing in the middle of the room with a fire poker in her hands, which was the most practical improvised weapon available and which she had positioned correctly. And he had a moment, brief and complicated and not appropriate for this corridor, of something that was not quite pride but was in the same province. She put the poker down when she saw him. Her face went through several things in rapid succession that she controlled before they could complete themselves. What remained was the expression he'd come to recognize as her operational face, the one that cataloged and assessed and moved forward. "How long do we have?" she said. "Minutes." The discrepancies, "I know, I need the paper." She reached into the bodice of her dress and produced the folded notation. He took it. Their fingers touched for a half-second in the exchange, and neither of them acknowledged it, and both of them registered it. "Can you run?" he said. "Yes." "Then run." They went. The garden wall was harder from the inside going out. She made it without assistance, which he noted, which went into the catalog that had been building for 3 weeks and was now a substantial document. They hit the street outside the palace grounds at a pace that was fast enough to cover distance and controlled enough to not be a spectacle, and Renveld met them at the corner with the 6 men in a closed carriage that had been waiting since before he'd gone over the wall, because preparation was the only thing that stood between plans and disasters, and sometimes the distance was narrower than you wanted. In the carriage, she sat across from him and breathed, and he breathed, and outside the city moved past, and neither of them spoke for 2 full minutes, which was the longest 2 minutes he could remember experiencing that weren't in a battlefield context. When he looked at her, her hands were still. The iron ring on her right hand caught the lamplight through the carriage window. "Grain," she said. "Aldrich has him watched. He'll have already communicated everything he needs to communicate. Watching him now is damage assessment, not prevention." "I know." "The assembly session convenes in 12 hours. We won't be there for it." She looked at him. "Where will we be?" He looked back. He had made the decision in the garden in the 10 seconds he had permitted himself, and it had not been a difficult decision in the way that people imagined difficult decisions. It had been the clearest thing he had thought since the warrant arrived. Clarity that came from finally being past the point where there were alternatives to choose between. "North," he said. "Home." She was quiet for a moment. "They'll declare you in contempt of the assembly. It'll upgrade the treason charge to both of us." "Yes." "They'll mobilize imperial forces within the week." "Yes." "That's war," she said. "That's the actual thing." "It's been the actual thing," he said, "since they put their hands on your father's name." He held her gaze. The question was never whether it was coming. The question was what we'd be standing on when it arrived. She looked at him for a long moment. He waited for the next question, the practical one, the catalog and assess response that was the way she processed everything. Instead, what crossed her face was something he had not seen there before, not in the ward, not in the cathedral, not in any of the rooms they had navigated together in 3 weeks. It was the expression of a person who has been operating in a state of braced endurance for a very long time and has just felt something in that structure shift. Not collapse. Shift. Change load-bearing points. She looked away, out the window at the dark city. "Your soldiers are ready? They will be in 3 days. 3 days is fast." "They've been ready for longer than 3 days," he said. "They've been ready since the first warrant." She absorbed this. He watched her absorb it. The specific way she processed information that changed the shape of what she thought she understood, integrating it without drama, updating the model. He had been watching her do this for 3 weeks, and it had not stopped being remarkable to him, which was itself information he was still working out what to do with. The carriage cleared the city's eastern gate into the open road, and behind them Vareth Prime receded in the dark, lit and humming, and already, he knew, beginning to generate the response, the machinery of imperial administration processing the evening's events and producing the appropriate documents and dispatching the appropriate communications and setting in motion the appropriate forces. 60,000 soldiers under his command, waiting in the north. 20 years of campaigns that had made the Empire's borders and remade them again. The Krena Pass, where history had been written in 3 days of decisions that the historians still argued about. He had never fought for himself. That was the truth of it, the thing that none of the accounts and none of the margin-noted histories captured. He had fought for the empire that had destroyed his family because fighting was the only thing available to him, and he was very good at it, and he had spent 20 years being very good at something he did not believe in for people he did not respect, and the specific quiet damage of that had been the actual content of those 51 years. Not the campaigns, not the dead wives, not the reputation that made rooms go silent. The damage of a man who had never had a reason that was worth the cost. He looked at her profile against the dark window, the line of her jaw, the way she held herself even exhausted, even still moving from the room and the run and 12 hours of being managed and threatened in a palace not her own. She had looked at him in the cathedral with compassion instead of fear. He had not known then what to do with it. He had not known then how thoroughly it would take apart everything he had built to keep people at the appropriate distance. He knew now. The carriage hit the northern road, and the horses settled into their pace, and somewhere behind them, a city was deciding what to do about the Ash Duke and his plain, unfortunate wife. And ahead of them, the northern hills were real, and the keep was real, and 60,000 soldiers were waiting on a word he had not yet given, but was now, for the first time in 20 years, fully prepared to give. He would send the word in the morning. What came after it? The fire and the march, and the full terrible weight of what he was capable of when he had a reason. He had been carrying in him for a long time, maintained like a weapon kept clean and oiled in a case he had decided once to never open again. His hand rested on that case now. In the capital, he knew, Vesperine was already moving. Whatever came next in the palace's east wing and the assembly room and the imperial administrative machinery, she was the one turning it, the one who had arranged the banquet and the server and the custody framing with the patience of a woman who had been building toward this for months or longer. She had gotten what she wanted tonight. She had separated them. She had put Selene on the other side of imperial doors and watched him calculate and hold still and let it happen. She had not, however, calculated what happened after a man stopped calculating. The road north was dark and cold and direct. Beside him, Selene had gone quiet in the way of someone gathering rather than withdrawing, building toward the next thing rather than recovering from the last. He knew this about her now. He knew the difference. "When we get back," she said, without turning from the window, "I want to talk to Grain." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I want to know who gave him the counter-signature," she said, "and because I think he'll tell me things he won't tell you." "Why?" She turned to look at him. Her eyes were steady and dark, and had the specific quality of someone who has never had the option of being fragile and has built something different in that place. "Because I'm the one who sat at his accounting table for 3 weeks and said good morning and treated him like a person," she said. "And that means something, even to someone who is working against us. Maybe especially to someone like that." He held her gaze. "You'll let me do it," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. She turned back to the window. The carriage moved north, and the city fell further behind them, and the stars over the open road were the clear, indifferent stars of a winter sky that had been doing this long before either of them existed and would continue long after. And Cassian Valecrest looked at them and felt, with the specific and unfamiliar weight of a man who has not felt this in a very long time, that he was moving towards something instead of away from it. And in the capital at his back, in the lit corridors of an imperial palace that had just discovered its primary leverage was gone, someone was already reaching for the next instrument, the harder one, the one designed not to negotiate but to end. The message would arrive at the northern keep in 3 days. By then the armies would be moving. By then, everything that could be undone would be past undoing. He closed his hand and opened it and looked at the road ahead. He was done waiting for the Empire to decide. The war lasted 4 months. Histories would argue about this later, whether it qualified as a war in the full sense or a campaign or something more compressed and specific that required its own vocabulary. What it was, in the experience of the people inside it, was a reckoning. The kind that empires accumulate across decades of small cruelties and deferred accountings, and then pay all at once when the wrong person finally decides the debt is due. Cassian sent the word north the morning after they arrived at Blackthorn. He sent it in the pre-dawn dark while Selene was still sleeping in the room with the window that looked at the hills, and he stood in the war room with the dispatch in his hand for a long moment before he gave it to the rider, not from hesitation, but from the specific weight of a man who understands precisely what he is releasing and chooses to release it anyway. The word went out. 3 days later, 60,000 soldiers began to move south under the skeletal ash tree banner, and the empire that had been compressing the north for 20 years discovered what compression produces when the container finally fractures. He did not fight it the way he had fought for the empire. He fought it the way a man fights when he has stopped performing for an audience and is simply doing the thing, efficiently, without theater. The campaign moved through the imperial middle provinces with the particular momentum of something that cannot be negotiated with because it has already done its negotiating and the negotiating failed, and city after city made the calculation that resistance was more expensive than its alternative. He was 51 years old, and he fought like a man with nothing to protect, which was the most dangerous kind of fighting there was, except that he also had everything to protect. And what that combination produced in the field was something that even his own senior officers spoke about afterward, in terms that had no clean precedent. Selene stayed at Blackthorn for the first 8 weeks. She had not been asked to stay. She had simply made the assessment that she was more useful there than in the field, that the northern estates needed management during a war that was drawing on their resources, and that there was specific work to do that required her presence and her particular skill set. She organized supply lines. She handled the communications that came from northern houses watching the campaign and deciding which side of history they wanted to stand on. She talked to Grain. That conversation happened on the 3rd day after their return, in the estate office with the door open and 2 of her chosen people in the corridor outside, and it lasted 2 hours. She did not tell Cassian everything that was said in it until much later. What she told him immediately was the name behind the counter-signature, a man in Emperor Lucian's personal secretariat, positioned there 8 years ago by a faction within the imperial court that had identified the Northern Licensing Authority as a long-term strategic target. Grain had been recruited 4 years into his tenure at Blackthorn, with the specific patience of people who understood that the most valuable assets were the ones that didn't know they were being built until they were already built. When she told him this, Cassian stood at the war room table and was very still for a long moment. "He told you all of it," he said. "He told me enough," she said. "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because at some point in the last 11 years," she said, "he started to mean it, the loyalty, and that made what he'd done unlivable." He looked at her. He thought about the difference between a man who betrays without conflict and a man who betrays with it. He thought about what she had known that he hadn't, the specific knowledge of how to sit across a table from someone and be genuinely present with them, not strategically present, not conditionally present, just there, attending, treating them as a person rather than a variable. He had watched her do it with every servant and soldier at Blackthorn for 3 weeks. He had thought it was kindness. He was understanding now that it was also a kind of intelligence, the kind that could not be acquired through campaigns or margin notes or 20 years of being very good at war. "What did you do with him?" he said. "I told him he could leave," she said. "North Border, new name." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's not what I would have done." "I know," she said. "That's why I did it." He held her gaze. Something in him that had been oriented toward the war recalibrated briefly toward this room and this woman and the specific shape of the life they were building in the margins of the fire he had started. Then he returned to the maps, because the fire still needed tending, and because she had understood before he did that the two things were not in conflict. The capital fell on a morning that was cold and clear, the kind of winter morning that did not offer the courtesy of bad weather to match the occasion. Cassian entered the city at the head of the advance, not from pride, not from symbolism, but because he had learned long ago that the places his soldiers were going, he should be willing to go first, and because the specific statement of it was one that required his presence. The city had not been put to the torch. He had been precise about this, and the precision had cost him 3 arguments with officers who thought precision was for people who hadn't been betrayed, and he had won all 3 arguments because he understood something they didn't yet. That what came after the war was what the war was actually for, and you couldn't build anything on ash that you'd created yourself. The palace was still defended when he arrived at its gates. Not heavily. The Empire's military capacity had been diminishing in inverse proportion to his campaign's progress, the particular collapse of an institution that had been supported more by the appearance of strength than its substance. What remained at the palace gates was the specific stubbornness of men who had sworn an oath and were keeping it because the oath was the only thing left that still had meaning. He respected this. He fought through it with the minimum force the situation required, and no more. Emperor Lucien met him in the throne room. This was not how these things usually went. Usually the end of empires was administrative, documents, surrenders, the transfer of seals. Lucien had chosen otherwise. He stood at the far end of the throne room in full imperial dress, without guards, which was either courage or a gesture calibrated to produce a particular legacy in the historical account. And Cassian had spent enough time around powerful men to know it was probably both simultaneously. He was perhaps 60 Lucian, the face of a man who had been making decisions since his 20s and had the specific wear of someone for whom power had been a burden worn long enough to leave permanent marks. He looked at Cassian across the length of the burning room. There was fire in the adjacent corridor, spreading from a torched archive. Nobody's direct intention but the consequence of 100 smaller decisions, and said, "I should have handled this differently." Cassian stopped walking. He was 20 feet away. His sword was drawn not because he'd drawn it for this room, but because he'd entered it still moving from the fight at the gate. He looked at Lucien and looked for the angle, the manipulation behind the admission, the strategic surrender designed to produce an outcome. He was good at finding angles. He'd built his career on it. He didn't find one. What he found was a tired man at the end of a line he'd followed for 30 years, making the one kind of honest statement that tends to arrive only when there's nothing left to protect by being dishonest. "Yes," Cassian said. "You should have." "She's a remarkable woman," Lucien said. "Your wife. I underestimated what she would mean to you." "Everyone did," Cassian said. "Including you," Lucien said. A silence. Fire moved in the corridor. Somewhere outside, the city was processing what was happening to it. Not with panic, he had made sure of that, but with the strange, rearranging quiet of a place that is becoming something different than it was. "What happens now?" Lucien said. Cassian looked at him. He thought about his family. He thought about the house that the Empire had compressed into nothing before he was old enough to understand what was happening to it. He thought about a warrant on a woman with no allies and no leverage and no family to demand retribution, and he thought about who had designed that warrant and what they had been counting on, and whether they had correctly calculated the cost. They had not correctly calculated the cost. "Now," Cassian said, "you step down. The administrative transfer will be handled by my legal office. Your personal safety is guaranteed as long as you cooperate with the transition process." He paused. "That's the offer." Lucien looked at him. "And Vesperine." The name landed differently than it had 3 months ago. He had been thinking about Vesperine for 4 months, in the margins of the campaign, in the way you think about something you are moving toward rather than away from. What she had built, the patience and architecture of it, the server at the banquet, the custody framing, the specific cruelty of using the language of protection to cage someone. "She's in the palace," he said. It wasn't a question. Lucian's expression answered it anyway. He found her in the East Wing, the same corridor where room 14 was. The symmetry of it was probably not accidental. She was a woman who understood the vocabulary of power and used it deliberately, and making her last stand in the location of her most successful move had the quality of a statement. She was not armed. She stood in the corridor with the posture of a woman who has run her calculations and arrived at an answer she doesn't like but intends to face standing up. He stopped 6 feet away. "Duke Valecrest," she said. Her voice was exactly what it had been at the banquet. Composed, warm at the surface, doing what surfaces do. "I imagine this is the part where you tell me what happens next." "I don't need to tell you," he said. "You've already calculated it." Something moved in her face. The first genuine thing he'd seen from her. Not the warmth, not the performance, but the actual woman underneath. The one who had spent 20 years building something intricate and patient in the corridors of an institution that rewarded exactly those qualities and was now watching that institution dismantle around her. "You could have negotiated," she said. "Early on, there were terms available." "The terms required me to hand her over," he said. "The terms required you to acknowledge the Emperor's authority," she said. "She was a mechanism. She wasn't the point." "I know what she was to you," he said. "She was never a mechanism to me." Vesperine looked at him. He saw it land, the specific impact of understanding that the fundamental calculation had been wrong from the beginning, not the tactics, not the timing, not the execution, the premise. She had looked at a plain orphan girl and a feared older duke and had seen exactly what the court saw. A political transaction, a vulnerability created by asymmetry, a lever. She had not seen what was actually there, which was the specific thing that all her intelligence and patience and 20 years of court architecture had not equipped her to recognize. "No," she said finally. "I suppose she wasn't." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about what Selene had done with grain, the open door, the northern border, the new name. He thought about what Selene would say if he described this corridor to her later. He thought about the margin note, not brutality, certainty. The difference matters. "You'll be removed from the capital," he said. "Permanent exile. The eastern coastal territories. You'll have access to your private funds and reasonable accommodation." He paused. "If you come back, the offer changes." She stared at him. "That's not what I expected." "I know," he said. "Why?" He thought about it honestly, because he owed himself at least that. "Because ending things is faster than continuing them," he said. "And because there's enough that needs to be built that I don't have time for what continuing you would cost." He walked past her. Her exile arrangements would be handled by Aldrich, who was already in the palace and already dealing with the 12 other people on the list of things that needed dealing with. The fire in the adjacent corridor had been contained. The throne room was quiet. He went to find Selene. Bess. She arrived 2 days after the capital fell. He had sent for her, not because she needed to see the aftermath, not for ceremony, but because the capital was part of what came next, and what came next was something they needed to begin together. She rode in with a party of 30, and she was not in the elaborate dress she'd worn to the banquet or the institutional white of the wedding. She was in northern riding clothes, practical and dark, and she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had ridden 2 days to get here and had things to do when she arrived. He met her in the palace courtyard. She dismounted and stood in front of him and looked at him with the specific comprehensive attention that he had been the subject of for 4 months from the north, while he was the subject of entirely different attention from everyone else. She looked at him the way she had looked at the keep on first arrival, cataloging what was real, what had been there a long time, what had been damaged, and what had held. She looked at the arm he was holding slightly wrong from a blade that had caught him in the final push into the palace. She looked at his face, which had more of the campaign on it than he'd intended to carry into this moment. "How bad is the arm?" she said. "Manageable." "That's not an answer." "It'll heal." "Cassian." He had still not entirely resolved what happened to him when she said his name. It had the same effect it had had in the banquet hall, something that required a different register than he normally operated in. Words from the undefended place. He was working on having access to that place. It was slow work. He suspected it would be slow for a while yet. 3 inches, he said. Deep. It's been closed. It'll leave a mark. She nodded. One more mark on a man who had several. She accepted this the way she accepted most things, without drama, without the performance of concern, with the actual thing instead of its performance. Lucienne, she said, transitioning out. The legal process will take several months. Grain's counter-signature in the secretariat. Handled. Vesperine. Exile. He paused. Eastern coast. She looked at him. He saw her process the specific quality of that decision. Not execution, not imprisonment, exile. He saw her understand why. Good, she said quietly. They stood in the courtyard of what had been the imperial palace of Verath Prime, and was now something that didn't have a clean name yet, in the clear winter light that had no interest in being symbolic. And he looked at her and thought about what the last 4 months had been, and what they had cost and what they had produced. He had spent 20 years being very good at something he did not believe in. He had spent those years maintaining the specific posture of a man who has accounted for everything and therefore has nothing that can be used against him. And this had been its own kind of survival, effective, functional, the kind of survival that keeps you alive and keeps everyone at a distance and costs you, slowly, everything that made the being alive worth the bother. She had walked down an aisle toward him in an adequate dress with her jaw set and her eyes up, and she had looked at him with something he had not seen in 20 years, which was the specific quality of attention that does not require you to be anything other than what you are. Not the terrifying Ash Duke, not the political variable, not the warlord or the monster or the instrument of empire. Just a man, standing at an altar, who had made a decision and was living with it. He had not known, then, what to do with that. He had learned. There's going to be a great deal of work, he said. Yes, she said. The northern territories will need restructuring, the licensing framework, the administrative transition. I know. It'll take years. I know that too. He looked at her. He had been building towards something he didn't have the right word for, in the way of a man who has spent his life in the vocabulary of war and is trying to speak in a different register and finding it requires different muscles. I need you to know, he said, that the war was not... He stopped, started again. What I did, the campaign, all of it, it was not only for you. I want to be honest about that. It was also for what your father's name deserved, for the 11 years before that, for the things I should have ended a long time ago and didn't. She looked at him steadily. But it was also for you, he said, specifically. That part isn't something I can make smaller than it is. She was quiet for a moment. The courtyard was alive around them, soldiers, staff, the practical noise of a city in transition, and she stood in the middle of it and looked at him with an expression that had something in it he had not seen on her face before. Not the operational composure, not the cataloging attention, something that had been behind all of that, the whole time, waiting for a moment that was worth the exposure. You were never a monster, she said. I want you to know I understood that before I was certain of anything else. He looked at her. People become what the world requires of them, she said. And then the world decides that's what they are, and stops looking for anything else. You had nobody looking for anything else for a very long time. She paused. That's not a small thing to live with. He said nothing for a moment. The arm ached. The courtyard moved around them. Somewhere in the city, his soldiers were doing the careful, unglamorous work of transition. The work that didn't make it into the histories but was the actual substance of what came after war. He thought about margin notes. He thought about the specific honesty of a woman who had looked at 3 conflicting historical accounts and told him she was still deciding. We should go inside, he said. There's a significant amount of documentation that needs... Cassian, she said. He stopped. She stepped forward. She put her hand on his face, not the arm, not the shoulder, his face, directly, the way you touch something you are deciding to claim. It was the most unguarded gesture he had received from another person in perhaps 30 years, and it landed in him like the first warm thing after a very long winter. He stood very still because he was a man who became very still when he encountered things he didn't know how to respond to and needed a moment to learn. She waited for the moment. She had always been good at waiting, not the passive waiting of someone with no options, but the patient waiting of someone who understands that some things require time and is willing to give it. He brought his hand up, covered hers, held it there. They stood like that in the courtyard of a fallen empire, in the thin winter light, in the specific and earned silence of two people who had come through something together and were still standing on the other side of it. But years passed in the way that good years do, marked not by crises, but by accumulation, by the slow and unglamorous work of rebuilding a territory that had been managed by compression for decades, and needed more than anything to be treated as though it mattered. Selene was better at this than anyone who had watched her walk down that cathedral aisle would have predicted, which was to say she was extraordinary at it in a way that had nothing to do with prediction and everything to do with who she had always been when the world wasn't performing its cruelties at her. She reorganized the northern administrative framework starting from the village level, which was where the framework touched actual human lives, and worked upward from there. She established a standing review process for the licensing documentation that had been used against them, making it structurally resistant to the kind of quiet alteration that had nearly destroyed everything. She talked to people, servants, soldiers, farmers, minor house representatives who had been watching the powerful perform at each other for decades and had never been asked what they actually needed. She was, in the north, simply Selene, not the plain orphan, not the Archduke's unfortunate wife, not the political variable, the woman who had spent a war managing supply lines and now spent peacetime managing something harder, the long, patient work of building things that lasted. Cassian watched her do this and understood, incrementally, over years, what she had been doing from the beginning, not surviving, building. The distinction was the one his father had been trying to make and had not had the words for, and that Selene had understood from some deep place that did not require articulation, that simply knew. You survive until you can build, and then you build. And the building is the point that the surviving was before. He was slower at it than she was. He had more to unlearn. 20 years of being the Archduke had left specific deposits, ways of standing in rooms, ways of assessing people as variables rather than presences, the habituated distance that had once been armor and was now simply old architecture that needed renovation. He worked on it the way he worked on everything, methodically, without theater, with the patient commitment of a man who has identified what is true and is moving toward it. The arm healed imperfectly. It left a scar that pulled occasionally in cold weather, which in the north was most of the year. He did not mind it. Scars were simply the record of things that had happened, not the things themselves, not the loss of what had been before them, but the evidence that you had been present when the thing occurred and had continued. He had a substantial record. He was learning to read it differently. But it was an evening in late autumn, 5 years after the capital fell, when she found him on the eastern rampart of Blackthorn. He was standing where he had stood the evening of the first warrant, looking at the hills in the way of a man who has looked at the same hills enough times to know them, the way you know the face of someone you've been beside a long time. The skeletal ash banner moved above him in the wind. He had not changed the banner. He had thought about it and decided against it, because the ash tree had been his family's before it had been the Empire's instrument, and because the past was not the thing you erased, but the thing you stood in honest relationship with. She came to stand beside him. She had her father's iron ring on her right hand. She had never moved it, and he had never asked her to. The Southern delegation sent their response, she said. And they'll agree to the revised terms. The licensing amendment clears by spring. Good. She stood beside him and looked at the hills. The evening was doing what northern evenings did in autumn, going dark early, going cold fast, without ceremony or apology. Somewhere below, the village at the base of the valley road had its lights on, the specific warm pattern of a place where people were inside, together, finishing the day. You're quiet tonight, she said. I'm often quiet, he said. You're quiet in a different way tonight. He looked at her. 5 years of this, of her reading the quality of his silences with the same precision she read documents, the same comprehensive attention she had been giving him since a cathedral aisle when he had done something he hadn't planned to do and hadn't been able to explain and hadn't tried to. My father built this rampart, he said. I used to stand here when I was 12 and watch the hills and think the north was the whole world. She was quiet, listening. Then the empire showed me how large the world actually was, he said, and I spent 20 years operating in it. And I came to believe that the size of a thing was what made it real. Large forces, large campaigns, large consequences. He paused. I was wrong about that. The village lights below, the wind in the banner, the hills going dark at their edges. The realest things, he said, have been here, in this specific place, with you. She looked at him. That expression again. The one that had been behind everything else from the beginning, the one that required exposure to show, and that she showed him now without reserve, because they had been through enough together that there was nothing to protect it from. You were never hard to love, she said. You were just surrounded by people who had decided it wasn't worth trying. He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about what it cost a person to say something that true, and what it meant that she said it plainly, without softening it for his benefit or hedging it against the possibility that he might not receive it. He thought about 20 years and what they had made of him, and what these 5 years had been doing, slowly, to the shape of what 20 years had made. He said because it was true, and because she had taught him that true things were worth saying plainly, you changed what I understood about what was survivable. She understood him. She had always understood him, from before she had reason to, from before he had given her adequate evidence. He had never determined whether this was something she had decided or something she had simply known, and he had long since stopped needing to determine it. Some things did not require a cause. They simply were, and you stood in relationship with them, and you let them matter. He put his hand at the back of her neck, carefully, with the specific care he had learned over 5 years of learning how to be careful in ways he had never been before, how to be present with someone without the buffer of operational distance. She leaned into it. Below them, the north, their north, the one they had built from warrant and fire, and 4 months of war and 5 years of unglamorous, real, patient work, sat in the autumn evening and continued. Markets and supply lines and village stores properly distributed and licensing frameworks resistant to manipulation, and people going about their lives without the particular compression of being managed by something that did not consider them worth managing well. The ash banner moved above them. He was no longer the Ash Duke in the way the name had meant. He was not certain yet what he was instead, beyond the specific and sufficient fact of this, a man standing at the edge of something he had helped build, next to the person whose presence had made building it possible, in the only place that had ever felt like his. That was enough. It was, he had learned, more than enough. It was, in fact, the point.